Well, good afternoon. I'm Reverend David, and thank you for joining me today for Disciple Time. One of the interesting things about being a father of four and a husband is there's never a dull moment in my house. I'm sure many of you can relate to this, and what I mean by that statement is there's always something that needs to be done. With four kids, there's always somewhere to be. And with six people walking through life, there's always something to occupy our shared thoughts as we each come together after a long day journeying through the world. Let's face it, we live in a go, go, go world. And as a husband and father, I'm always looking for like little life hacks just to make the most out of my time. So the question I have for us today is, what if someone claimed that there was a way that in 1 hour of our time, we could learn more about who we are, more about God's will for our lives, and make more progress in our spiritual journey than we could if we'd spent an entire year reading books? Wow. That would be pretty miraculous life hack, wouldn't it? I mean, I spent a lot of years in seminary reading a lot of books, and I learned quite a bit in that reading. But in my own spiritual journey this week, I came across someone who made this exact claim, and so I thought I would share it with you today on Disciple Time. In his book, Rediscover Catholicism, a spiritual guide to living with passion and purpose, Matthew Kelly makes that claim. He says, you can learn more in 1 hour of silence than you can in a year from books. Well, what do you think Matthew Kelly is talking about? He's talking about the prayer of silence. He's talking about reclaiming a time and a space to quiet the noise of our day-to-day busyness so that we can develop our spiritual listening skills. And Kelly raises some important questions for us as modern-day Christians in this book. He talks about the noise of the world and how it's easy to find ourselves waking up to music on our cell phones. I've done it myself. Listening to music as we take our shower, then watching the morning news while we eat breakfast, getting in our car, listening to the radio on the way to work. And then, of course, once we're at work, we have the busyness of work going on. But then in those breaks between the busyness at work, maybe checking our social media. And then what happens after work? Maybe we go home, we watch some more news, maybe pick up a TV program. For some of us, we play video games. But seldom do we make time to sit in total silence with the intent of listening. In fact, sometimes the world can even make us feel guilty, or sometimes we put guilt on ourselves for taking time out of that busyness to just sit in silence. But this is an important spiritual discipline. In fact, Kelly writes, we have so much noise, we can't even hear ourselves think. How do you imagine that in the midst of all that noise, you're going to work out who you are and what you're here for? The reality is, you won't unless you withdraw from all the noise of your life and the world for a few minutes each day. You will most likely just become another cog in the global economic wheel, consuming and being consumed. Wow. Matthew Kelly was able to write that in a way that was just really profound. And that's a pretty powerful statement. Now, I was fortunate to have someone in seminary, that was Dr. Brian Russell, who shared this practice of praying in silence with me. And Kelly points out that the church has a long cherished practice of the prayer of silence. In fact, even C.S. Lewis understood the power of prayer of silence and featured it in his book titled The Screwtape Letters. Now, If you've never read the Screwtape Letters, I would like to also recommend that book, because in it, C.S. Lewis is writing from the perspective of a senior demon named Screwtape, who's trying to train up an apprentice demon named Wormwood in how to pull people away from God and make them ineffective as Christians. So he's writing from a totally different perspective on spiritual disciplines, which is interesting. And most of all the tactics in the book are designed to keep the young Christian away from the deep prayer of silence. And one such method that Screwtape gives Wormwood for this purpose is to create so much noise that men and women can no longer hear the voice of God in their lives. That was a tactic that the demons were sharing with each other to keep Christians ineffective. Well, I would say that if we're not careful, the devil could certainly create so much noise in our lives that we would be hard-pressed to hear God. But one of the things that I like about Kelly's book is he offers a remedy for this problem, and it's an age-old spiritual discipline that's been used for thousands of years. Now, don't you love it when we don't have to reinvent the wheel? The remedy is simple, and that is determine to set aside 10 minutes a day for the prayer of silence. Now, some call this centering prayer, and I have done a couple of videos on this that you can find on my YouTube channel, but there's one thing that Kelly said that I believe takes this practice to the next level, and that is setting aside specific times to engage in the prayer of silence in your local church before the presence of the Eucharist. Kelly writes this, I believe that Jesus Christ is present in the Eucharist, and that he is present in a very powerful way. Well, he also says, I think his presence makes a difference. How could it not? Of course it makes a difference. Well, I agree with Kelly, because in my own spiritual journey, one of the most powerful prayer spots I ever had was in the prayer room right in the church building. Now, I didn't pray in that prayer room every day. Oftentimes, I did my prayers in my own sacred space in my home, and I want to recommend that you have a sacred space for your prayers at home to do this practice. But there was always something special about intentionally going to the church building, going to the prayer room to have 10 or 15 minutes alone with God in a room that has been cleansed and anointed for that purpose, right in front of the Eucharist. Well, so this week my challenge is really simple. Let's be intentional about stopping the noise, the internal dialogue, the mental chatter. Let's turn off the radio while we're driving. Let's skip a TV show. Let's put our social media away for a minute and make space for 10 minutes of silence somewhere in our day, so that by the grace of God, our minds can find the quietness to hear the Word of God speak in the still small voice which comes through the prayer of silence. Well, thank you for joining me today. Have a blessed day. Christ in every